Islands are awesome. Control of some specific islands in our real-world history have led to victories in war, solidifications of empires, and some of the greatest struggles in human history. But controlling an island is hard. Every single inch of your coastline is a potential landing site. And in D&D styled worlds, a single ship full of belligerents, especially if they have magic, could be all it takes to take over an entire island nation. Much like firearms were a force multiplier when colonial powers were roaming the seas, so too is magic an integral tool for asymmetric warfare. Especially if you rule that teleportation circles can be placed on the deck of a ship. Suddenly, you're summoning your entire army after just one ship makes it to the shore. Yes, it technically needs to be cast on the ground, but what is ground at sea? To do an aerial survey, all you need is Find Familiar. To scout an ambush, you just need divination magic. And to feed an entire army out in the field, well, all you need is a few casters of Goodberry. It might actually be easier than you think to take an entire island for yourself in a D&D world. But equally, defending such a place may prove fascinating too, and we might see some very unique developments in D&D style worlds that we don't see in ours. Today, we're taking a look at island defences, how to beat them, and how islands are some of the most strategically significant places in the world. Big or small, the main historic uses for islands in our history has been habitation. This makes some degree of sense. It's very hard for a warlord to march his army across to your place of living and take over if there's a sea in the way. The only downside to this is when ships become more commonplace, islands are suddenly the premier spot to fill your stomachs, do some trade, and catch up with all of the other seafaring nations in one convenient little place. You've got a lot more visitors than you would ever have hoped for. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the Mediterranean Sea, as historically we have pretty much every seafaring civilization that cares about trade in the Mediterranean at some point taking an island or two to enable their trade routes. Large islands are generally wanted by empires and nations, especially if they have some promising port sites. But equally, it is much easier to defend a smaller island. Let's explore some real-life examples from the Mediterranean Sea. Palermo, a coastal city on a very desirable stretch in the middle of a busy Mediterranean Sea. It's known by many names, from the Phoenician cis, meaning flower, to its modern moniker as the most conquered city in the world. Originally, it was inhabited by the Sicani, who were conquered by the Phoenicians, who were colonized by the Carthaginians, who were kicked out by the Romans, who were unseated by Germanic tribes. In 831, Palermo was seized by the Saracens and rebuilt in an Islamic style before Norman Crusaders conquered, putting their architectural stamp on the city in a blend of both. It was then taken by the Holy Roman Empire, where it formed part of the late Middle Ages constant plays for power and land in Europe, before joining with the Kingdom of Naples, which eventually joined the Kingdom of Italy, which would later become the modern Italian Republic. With Sicily being so central to Mediterranean trade and so geographically central too, its position and history makes for a true melting pot of culture, architecture, and people. If an island, therefore, is strategically significant to a lot of different peoples, its history is likely to be exceptionally interesting, and its culture to reflect a lot of this historical attempted grabs for power, as we can see by this Norman/Arabic architecture in the shot behind me. The history of Malta is very much like the history of Sicily, up until nearly the end of the Middle Ages, at which point something very interesting happens. The Knights of St. John, a holy order of crusaders,
take over this particular island and defend it for the next 200 to 300 years. They build much of the infrastructure you can see behind me and managed to defend from various different sea-bound threats. It was only possible for this order to even hold Malta because of the small size of the island. Otherwise, the Order of St. John would have been pushed out at the earliest possible convenience of any serious power. Here in Marseille, the Château d'If is a really famous location, made famous as a prison, escaped from by the legendary and fictional Count of Monte Cristo. But it wasn't always a prison. This was an attempt at a 1500s fort to protect the sea. It was a really small island, still is, and a fortification was built with the intention of protecting the city of Marseille. That never really panned out. Château d'If never really came under serious threat from any naval opposition, and so by the 1700s was turned into a prison, a very successful one from which no one in history ever escaped. Always controlled by the city of Marseille, it was a powerful symbol of the city's defences, even if it wasn't an active military fortification for most of its history. This is testament to the fact that even the smallest of islands, if located correctly, if centred on a city's powerful port, can be incredibly, incredibly useful and get some good stories out of it too.
As you can see, size and location are two hugely important factors in the defence of an island. A religious order can defend an entire island for hundreds of years given the right conditions, and even a small fort garrison can be instrumental in keeping hold of a small enough island. It's pretty easy to imagine a clerical order or an order of paladins laying claim to their own island very much in the same way as happened with Malta. The same with pirates, as happened in the island of Tortuga. It is entirely feasible to defend and control an island, that most important of seafaring resources, with a relatively small group of dedicated individuals. Of course, an island is easiest to defend when it doesn't matter very much, when its location is frankly terrible and not very desirable. The trouble with the Mediterranean is that all of these islands are generally pretty useful for stopping legs of seafaring, and control of them has been fought over for a few thousand years now. One good example of an island that wasn't particularly interesting is the North Sentinel Island, part of an archipelago of 600 other islands, which is still to this day ruled over by the native inhabitants. Despite violent and sometimes deadly confrontations with the British Navy and various other foreign powers, over the years, the Sentinelese have managed to keep a hold of their island, largely because it wasn't worthwhile for any navy to really push them out of their home. The island wasn't terribly strategically important, and there were hundreds of others to choose from with less hostile or no natives. So despite the classic British naval attitude, it simply wasn't deemed worth it to barge in and teach those savages a lesson. Equally, an island can be left alone for the exact opposite reason. It is simply a little too remote. The Pitcairn Islands are a prime example of this, being where the mutineers of HMS Bounty decided to settle down in the middle of the ocean. They weren't expecting to ever be found. Ironically, over the next few years, the island saw more visitors than at any point in history, as people wanted to understand exactly what had happened with the Bounty. But by the time the British Navy had made it to Pitcairn Island in force, 24 years later, all but one mutineer had already died. It did eventually become a British colony in the loosest possible sense, but that is largely because the original settlers from the mutiny felt that they were British already. Generally, the only people who make the long trek to the Pitcairn Islands for the rest of history are British supply ships, missionaries, and the odd whaler who stops in there on a long-distance sea voyage. The best defence from occupation or colonisation in history, really, seems to be to have a small island that is so useless for most of the regular trade routes that ships take that nobody can be bothered to visit it, let alone take it. The Sentinelese defend their island even today with some of the metal from the couple of shipwrecks that have ever managed to run aground there. Although their island is technically under the stewardship of India by way of Britain, of course, even without the modern laws that protect the uncontacted natives from outsiders, I would be very surprised if the Sentinelese didn't have their own island anyway. Regarding the defences of an island, not just obscurity, we'll go back to the last of my examples that I visited in real life, Chateau d'If. This was originally a sea fort just outside the harbour, providing a second point of defence for the city. It's almost like a shield for the mainland. If you don't take both Marseille and the sea fort, you've not fully taken the city. That's the thinking behind it, at least. Even though the sea fort's garrison is quite small, they could hold out for quite some time, offering resistance, especially as they had sight of the harbour. Oftentimes, the sea forts out in the harbour of a city are something of a sacrificial lamb, a limited resource that can be sacrificed to let the rest of the city have some time. It has to be addressed in some way. It cannot quite simply be ignored by an invading fleet. The simple fact is, it is easier to rebuild a fort than to unburn a town. This is also true in Malta, which is perhaps the premier example of sea forts in the world. The neighbouring islands of Gozo and Comino were both independent sea forts right next to the coast of Malta, as well as Malta having its own fortifications in each important harbour, including the Grand Harbour defence of Fort St Elmo, which is what I was standing in front of in the rather windswept shot. Natural defences like cliffs and rocky shorelines also help significantly in fending off, or at least directing, funneling an attack to certain important choke points. Before cannon were in use, sea forts also served a major purpose in scouting and relaying messages to important cities downriver, as most sea raids, a common misconception, would involve people sailing down into a major river towards the city that was maybe a mile or two inland. But what about in a world filled with magic? Well, in my opinion, sea forts might even be easier to build than in our own, seeing as Wall of Stone is a spell in almost every edition of D&D. It's a really potent building tool for getting a solid enough fortification ready fast. Secondly, the traditional design of the sea fort might actually be rather unchanged in a fantasy world, considering they are generally quite squat structures made of stone with stone roofs, maybe a central courtyard. The thing is, this doesn't just defend well against naval attacks, but aerial attacks too. If your soldiers have cover from every conceivable angle, perhaps barring a central courtyard which can also be defended with netting, it's unlikely that even a dragon would want to take on a sea fort. Furthermore, with a magical world in play, you might not even need cannon to ward off enemy ships, considering underwater peoples could make a real nuisance. Tearing planks off the bottom of a ship, the hardest place to fix, and the ubiquity of fire spells in almost every form of fantasy media. Fire, a ship's worst enemy. Ships are so vulnerable to fire. They are gigantic wooden coffins floating in the middle of impassable terrain, filled with, oftentimes, alcohol and explosives, with great sheets of fabric placed above them. And if any mage in the land can theoretically summon fire and hurl it towards a ship, that might be distinctly worrisome. It might cause ships to keep their distance, much like the deterrent of fortified structures with cannons in place. Add to that the potency of water magic and wind magic in causing massive disturbances to the way ships would like to move, and you might seriously be able to sink or capsize a ship with a few mages stationed inside a sea fort looking out of arrow slits. Firebombs dropped from above by familiars would also be a nightmare to deal with for an invading ship as well. The trouble with defending in general, though, is that ships move much faster than an army, and if you have the weaker navy, and coastal settlements have the most to lose in any naval warfare, if your coastal settlement is being battered by the enemy's cannon or magic for long enough, they've really done their job already, without even needing to land on your shore. In an ideal case, with the scouting and divining opportunities available through magic, towns would get some significant warning of an incoming attack, may be able to evacuate, but this would still cause incredible unrest and untold destruction. It would destroy the morale of any defensive island civilization. Although back to a weakness on the offensive side, a really common strategy in taking an island wholesale is to blockade it. Especially when that island has allies that are trying to feed its supplies. Destroying or turning away supply ships that are attempting to refuel and restock the resources of an island is a really nasty and really effective way of forcing a surrender and a peaceful transition to your ownership. However, siege tactics are likely impossible in a D&D styled world with D&D's magic system, as long as you have enough spellcasters, due to the absolute prevalence of relatively serviceable magical food. A small garrison in a sea fort can theoretically hold out forever if they have just a few mages on staff. You see, unlike in our world where a blockade largely leads to surrender through the systematic starvation of those being blockaded, the tables are flipped. As long as you have strong enough defences, i.e. stronger than wooden ships, you're going to win the drawn out war, eventually. If your defences are made of stone, there's not really too much a ship can do by getting close, and if you're already self-sustaining magically on your island, it's probably best for the blockaders to actually try and assassinate your mages before actually making a move on any of your fortified structures, or, raiding your coastal towns. It brings their ships in far too close to the shore, where they are to some extent vulnerable, especially to the magic we discussed earlier. With magical power being equal, it is almost impossible for a naval blockade to actually outlast an island community. If the invaders actually decide to land on your island, well then whittling them down with asymmetric guerrilla warfare using magic is the solution. Especially making good use of illusion magic, especially in the canopies, to avoid that familiar aerial scouting. The absolute worst case scenario for an island-based defense, though, is if your enemies are able to teleport in supplies and troops to their position to reinforce them. An island that in peacetime decides to invest in a teleportation circles to solve its biggest issues with, getting stuff and enacting proper trade with people around the world, might find itself really quite scuppered if the sigil to their teleportation circle leaks and an opposing force decides to teleport an army en masse straight into their civic and trade centre. The only way really around this is heavily guarding or perhaps even trapping your own teleportation circle when it's not being used for official business. And even then, you have the chance of being betrayed by a trusted ally. Equally, if teleportation circles can be placed on the deck of a ship, they're considered potentially ground, then it mitigates one of the biggest weaknesses of an invading landing party: not having enough people available just to take across on a ship. If the ship does the hard work with its skeleton crew and then gets an army instantaneously, that is a massive problem, and immediately, if that sort of a ship is spotted, which would probably need to have some significant defences against the waves anyway to make sure that the investment was protected, if a ship like that is spotted, then the number one priority for any defender must be to destroy the deck or destroy the ship itself as quickly as possible. It becomes a race against time, especially if you're against a larger nation that can keep on pumping out reinforcements throughout the entire battle. Keeping a dedicated community of underwater allies, in this case, would be a godsend. Islands should really be inviting undersea peoples of all stripes, as long as they can reasonably cooperate, to live just off their shores. They're so incredibly useful because the weakest point in a ship, at least to be repaired, is in the bilges. If the bottom of the ship is already filled with water, it is really difficult to find the exact points where planks have been stripped away by enterprising sea elves with conch-based crowbars. It's just an absolute nightmare for any sailing vessel, and you're probably going to need to have the invention of, most likely, metal underhulls to counteract the potency of an undersea crew attempting to dismantle your ship from the bottom up. There is one other kind of attack that island communities can suffer and have suffered throughout history: raiding. Alongside long campaigns, blockades, and full-on invasions, raids are a really common historic feature of peoples who want to get in, get stuff, and get out before there's any trouble. Raids have also been used as part of mass warfare to demoralise citizens by the coast and stretch supply lines to a breaking point. The trouble with living on an island is that your settlements tend to be, mathematically, less far from the sea. While it is true that most countries with a coastline do have major cities on the coast, it is also true that to take the country is much more difficult than simply taking a coastal city, as you can guarantee that there will be reinforcements coming in from less coastal cities further inland. Having longer, flatter, less rounded coastlines also provides you more visibility and more scouting for attacks coming from various directions as well. Unlike islands where potentially there is only one point which can see a particular approach if you're very unlucky, especially if you're within an island chain that blocks your view in various different directions. Mages and militia can't be in every coastal village on an island at once, and islands rely heavily, generally, on fishing to support their populations. And you can't really run an important and major fishing operation if you're not near the water. Thus, islands become an ideal target for raiders. And many of the things we've discussed so far don't actually work as defences, because raiders aren't looking to actually invade, to land on the ground, and some of the defences we discussed are simply too expensive or too difficult to put in every single coastal settlement around your island. Firstly, raiders still do need to be very cautious in a fantasy world, perhaps more cautious, because a single bolt of flame from 100 feet away can very well set fire to the sails of the ship you arrived on, which would cause significant problems because that gives the militia time to arrive, and the locals may in fact be able to fight back if they know you're not leaving immediately. Raids need to be conducted far more carefully just in case a mage is in hiding near the docks. Secondly, in a world with very, very active gods, they might be committing some grave, heinous sin, which is punished almost instantly by the protector god of these lands when they raid or pillage. The Viking raid in 793 in Lindisfarne might have gone very differently indeed if the Christian god had started just smiting Vikings the moment they entered the monastery. But with that said, with judicious use of fog cloud, pass without trace, and silence, raiders may still be able to get the jump on unsuspecting settlements, especially under cover of night. It may be that their initial strategy for the raid is to scout out silently, to find where any mages might be holed up and take them out first, either killing them or kidnapping them, to be indoctrinated into a further raiding party in the future, potentially, or to be very, very prized gifts or possessions to their lord. Perhaps there has been a spate of mages kidnapped from across a coastline, specifically because it makes the raiders' jobs easier when they come back, and mages are valuable. You can sell them, especially a well-trained one, for quite some money. Unfortunately for the defenders, raiding parties are generally well-organised shock trooper types, and the locals, fishermen nor monks, generally aren't. Although, again, that Lindisfarne monastery raid might have gone very differently if the monastery was filled instead with fantasy clerics and fantasy monks. The only other real idea I have for prohibiting raiding on a certain small fishing village is creating a rather unnavigable undersea environment out of sharp rocks, probably using magic. Locals and very small fishing boats would be able to navigate it fine, but a large enough ship might run aground a few hundred meters away from the coast. This has the disadvantage of discouraging sea-based trade, but if you're a small fishing village on the same island as a larger settlement just over there, it's probably easier to have a road and actually have some defense against raiders. Alternatively, you could have a mage, an earthworking mage, develop a large, seriously impressive barrier island, creating a lagoon for you to still fish in, but making it so that any raiding ship has to navigate around the barrier island to get into your space, effectively trapping them or slowing down their approach time quite significantly if your harbour's in the centre and they've got to go all the way round to get into where they want to be doing their raid. But then again, this is war, and in war, innovations come thick and fast. Maybe the raiders are using flat-bottom ships to protect themselves from your undersea defences. Maybe they've got merfolk advanced scouts swimming ahead or sitting under the waterline watching out for threats, able to communicate up with the steersman on the back. Or perhaps the raiders simply drop anchor further around a bay or hide behind other pieces of land and come in from the land this time instead. A way will be found, adjustments will be made, and the eternal arms race of conflict will continue, as it always has. A rather bleak sentiment, but that is what we're going to bring the video to a close with. As always, I'd really appreciate if you did the classic YouTube things. I'm sure you know what they are by now. But with that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. Thank you so very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.